of what the Buddhists, the Buddhist monks and so forth, and the scripted companies recognize is that we have to balance the miserable with something fun. So it was shortened to a 3-play format, of which there was an interlude that was usually something that was a servant outsmarting a master, or some other theme that had a more light and comic element to it. And I've seen a few of these, and they're very funny, you know. It's very broad, but it also acts as a relief to the misery and dourness of some of the others. So now we have this sort of like back and forth, yin-yang almost, kind of balance between the joy and farcical comedy to that which is more, I'll call it severe. Okay? But note, as I pointed out earlier, this is largely entertainment for the top 4 castes of Japanese society, which sort of leaves the others out wondering, hey, how come you guys get all the fun? We want something for ourselves. At which point, around about 1300 or so, we have the emergence of doll theater. So it starts to show up around the late 1300s, 1400s, and became very popular in the 1600s. And this was a mechanism of performance outside of the severity and structure of the No theater, albeit still influenced, particularly in the story content. But now we are actually starting to tell stories as opposed to sort of demonstrating a condition. The dolls, typically they started off as just a head operated by one person. And in this case, the narrator would provide all of the dialogue. So the narrator would not only set up the circumstance, but also provide the women's voice as well as the men's voice, and so forth. Okay? So the one narrator provides all of the dialogue. Later, as they evolved from just a head to create bodies and arms, and by the late 1600s and 1700s, they are now operating with eyes that can move, digits that can move individually. All of the limbs can move, so that they're becoming almost lifelike. And it's evolved into what's known today as bunraku puppets, which if you ever get to go to someplace like the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which I recommend you all should do, that's your mecca, sometime in your lifetimes, go to Edinburgh in August, save your pennies, because you will see thousands and thousands of live performances that some of them are crap, some of them are, stand-ups who think way too much of themselves. But you would get a chance to see a bunraku puppet show followed by an old-time mime carnival, followed by eco-clowns, all sorts of new and different things. Last time I was there, which was 3 years ago, in this 3-week period, there were 2,372 shows running at the same time. Okay? And it literally runs from 10 a.m. in the morning to about 2 a.m. There are hundreds of shows playing in venues like bank lobbies, and there are some actual real theaters too. But, so it's a place where you can see a lot of this stuff that we're talking about.
It's all day long, you said? Or
all day long. So the narrator provides all the dialogue. The performers are fully visible, but what was significant about this is that this was available to everybody, all the way down to the peasant class. Okay? So we start to now see the information and stories of the heritage of Japan now presented to the entire population through the form of doll theater. Okay? So it extended the premises of No by adding some storytelling elements more involved music in the instrumentation innovation, such as we saw the other day, was the samisen that was plucked and 3 strings, whereas before it had largely been a single string instrument. But the most important feature of this is that we're now really telling full stories that have complete beginnings, middles, and ends. So, its popularity, although it's still around today, and it still ran in through about the 16, 17, even into the 1800s, into the 19th century, its popularity waned, and the form was absorbed into kabuki, which sort of really became a live version of doll theater. Again, largely because it's a lot more flexible. You are able to show more as a human being than you are as a doll, although some of the doll things were pretty neato, I gotta say. A lot, such as Love Suicides, several of the doll theater scripts were simply absorbed into becoming kabuki performances and are now part of the full kabuki lexicon. Our author, Chikamatsu Matsuemon, is the most prolific and popular, and was at the time. There's certainly others, but he was largely copied quite a bit. And what we saw was a 3-act contemporary life play, the Sewamono, and there are also the Jidaimono, which are much longer, tragic plays, usually centered around the samurai and or the shame of losing one's position in society. And he largely was responsible for the kind of creating the bridge for what was kabuki, and I'll explain more about that in a second, the sort of early days of kabuki, which was largely improvised and very much dance-oriented, into adding very structured and specific stories into them. Okay? So he kind of laid the foundation for what the expectation is. Now there are history plays like the 47 Ronin, which we'll get to in a second, that are 11 acts long. So, So kabuki in its origin is assigned to this person, Okuni, who was a priestess, dancer, and prostitute, who started combining this sort of like doll theater influence masked performance, or at least painted mask, I should say, into improvised dances that were telling stories, largely again from the narrator on the outside. But this created such a stir in its erotic depiction in many instances, including the fact that the women were dressing as men, that the entire movement, here we go again, just like in the Roman days when the Christians started to come in, was associated with salacious, naughty behavior that could not be controlled. Okay? So it became associated with prostitution, partly because the initial performers were in fact prostitutes. Doing their job. So, I think it was in 1629, the shogunate said, "That's it! No more women performing! Not allowed!" So, it morphed into adolescent boys performing the female roles. And in the 1650s, guess what? The adolescent boys were arousing the audience to the point where the behaviors that were being displayed were no longer controllable, and they were outlawed. So this is where the origin of the all-male performances comes from.
So who didn't arouse them? Other old men. My man.
I'm gonna reserve comment on that question.
Oh, come on, Tom.
Come on, honest question.
I want only horses shall portray the role.
So, again, this partly around the same time, 1603, is literally when the Elizabethan theater is having its heyday, and same thing. Women performing on stage in Europe was considered to be vulgar and considered to be an obscenity, considered to its incite eroticism to the point where people can't control themselves.
What do you mean by that? People can control themselves.
I'll let you fill in your imagination there.
Even France was like that, Tom?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, so kabuki is not really sort of centered in the basis of literature, like, for example, Shakespeare is. But as you saw from the clips that we showed the other day, it is a grand performance spectacle. So the literature for it is a framework and outline for this spectacle. Okay? It's very over the top, very extreme, takes whatever emotional reactions are available and blows them up as fully and as broadly as possible. And in that respect, it's very much like Western opera, where we are taking one emotional reaction and we are going to sing about it for the next 12 minutes. Okay? So that kind of overt display is a kind of a direct correlation. So we're seeing these extreme heightened behaviors and a